Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Hello, lovely listeners. This is James Delingpole on episode 4 of Delingpole, brought to you courtesy of Breitbart by Podcast One. The good news is things are going really well. Loads of you, at least 6 I think, have given me 5-star reviews on iTunes. Hint, hint, bloody hint. Also, I finally got an attachment for my microphone, which means it will probably make fewer popping noises. And all manner of amazing, fascinating people are queuing up to be guests on the show, because they know it's the route to fame, riches, stardom, and a really, really great chat with me, James Delingpole. This week's special guest is Tim Shipman. He's the political editor of the Sunday Times, and I'm going to be talking about his excellent new book, All Out War. No, not that kind of war, unfortunately, not where brutally aggressive, incredibly well-armed nations fight to the death in horrifically bloody battles described in lavishly gory detail, much as I might love to read that book, and if you write it, I will definitely have you on the show. No, Tim Shipman's book is not about real war, but political war. Specifically the events leading up to what was undoubtedly the most important political event in Britain in my lifetime, the Brexit vote in the EU referendum. I don't think you need to be one of my UK listeners to appreciate the significance of that Brexit vote. It was about something bigger than British sovereignty. It was about a struggle that's going on all over the world right now. I'm talking about the battle between the people and an entrenched, remote, democratically unaccountable and, frankly, disgusting elite. That was what was so special for me about the EU referendum. For once it felt like your vote actually counted for something. And the political elite just weren't prepared for it, which is why the result came as such a shock, and why the losers still aren't accepting the vote, because they're not used to losing. They're the establishment elite. They're used to everything going their way. I'll give you one example of this. I've just got to the bit in the book where Shipman talks about 2 of the leading Remainers, Prime Minister David Cameron and Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne. Cameron has just got back from his negotiations with the various heads of state from the European member states, in which he's tried to get something, anything, to bring back to the British people to impress them with the amazingness of the deal he's managed to get for them. And basically he's come back with nada, zip, zilch. The EU leaders are so confident that the EU is inescapable that they're not going to offer Cameron even the slightest sop. But Cameron, instead of saying, right then, sod you, I'm going to stand up for what I believe in and campaign for leave, he comes home and he tries to pull a fast one on the electorate. People, he says, check out this amazing bag of beans I've got. Aren't these just the best beans you've ever seen? They're like wonder beans. We can stay in the European Union after all because magic beans make everything nice. And when no one believed him, he was shocked. Why was he shocked? Because what Cameron didn't quite get was that unlike him and his Chancellor Osborne, other people have these things called principles. There's a telling moment in Shipman's book where Cameron discovers this. Cameron has been working on the assumption that no matter how crap the deal he gets, he can count on the support of most of the MPs in his party because, well, why not? He's Prime Minister, they're his minions, they owe him their loyalty. Instead, where he's expecting only a handful of his MPs to support the Brexit cause, in fact, over 140 do, including his cleverest thinker, Michael Gove, and his biggest crowd puller, Boris Johnson. Cameron is gobsmacked. So is George Osborne. As Liam Fox, another Vote Leave MP, is quoted as saying in the book, it's like this. And Liam Fox says, so here is one of the MPs quoted in the book, talking about George and Dave and their attitude. Dave and George are furious at the lack of deference from their junior MPs. They're unprepared for the level of ideology. For George and Dave, Euroscepticism has always been a tool to use, not a position they actually believe in. They thought everyone behaved like that. They miscalculated. So there it is. Ideological principle on the one hand, Bismarck-style politics is the art of the possible. So there it is. Ideological principle on the one hand, Bismarck-style politics is the art of the possible, weaselly pragmatism on the other, which for me sums up the essence of the EU debate and the EU campaign. Brexiteers were voting because they wanted to do the right thing, to be free, regardless of the cost. The Remainers were voting for the status quo, not out of any especial moral principle, but merely because it was convenient and it wouldn't rock the boat. Anyway, in this podcast, what I'm going to do is talk to Tim Shipman a bit more about some of the personalities involved in the referendum campaign. Was it a foregone conclusion? And if it wasn't, who were the key figures in the Brexit camp who made this surprise victory possible? Do read the book. It's called All Out War, and it's more gripping than a book about recent politics has any right to be. You're listening to James Delingpole on the show they call Delingpole. It's brought to you by Breitbart and Podcast One, and it's bloody great. So remember to give it a 5-star review on iTunes.
Do you like scary radio dramas? Tune into Fangoria's Dread Time Stories, fully dramatized horror stories hosted by Malcolm McDowell.
Irony is only one small ingredient of these Dread Time Stories.
Hear a new episode every other week on the Podcast One app, iTunes, and podcastone.com.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Tim, we've never met before, so I'm not totally sure whether you are a slimy, disgusting piece of Remainer scum or whether you're a heroic, noble Brexiteer in your sympathies.
I'm afraid I was a cowardly Remainer who bought virtually every one of Michael Gove's arguments about sovereignty but was fearful of economic catastrophe. I also had a slight family involvement, as people reading this book will come to realise. My wife was head of events for the Remain campaign, so I had to hide my light under a bushel, but at the same time my reporting, I think, of what happened during that campaign enraged the Remain side rather more than the forces of Vote Leave. So if we're going up to the pearly gates of Brexit, I think my docket is okay from the point of view of Brexiteers.
Well, you did at least report for a pro-Leave newspaper, did you not?
That's right. I mean, we declared for Brexit on the final weekend, but such is the way at the Sunday Times. We went with where the best stories were. On that final weekend, we had an interview with David Cameron, and we put that on the front of the paper. But in the leader column, we declared for Brexit. A couple of weekends before, we revealed details of these diplomatic memos which suggested that Cameron wasn't entirely telling the truth about what he was planning to do with the Turks, and that sent Number 10 into a death spiral of rage, I would say.
So you may have actually helped contribute to the
my wife effectively told me that I'd cost her the referendum and kicked me out of the marital bed for 3 nights as a consequence. So they
can be like that, girls, can't they?
Well,
wives. I'm lucky.
She's a very fine woman, but like a lot of people, she found it quite a traumatic experience.
Do you know what? I've got the opposite kind of wife. My wife almost kicked me out of the bedroom for failing to show sufficient zeal during the referendum campaign. Like, why aren't you doing more? Why don't you ring up Dominic Cummings and find out whether you can help him? I'm sure Dominic would have told me to fuck off or something.
Well, Dominic tells a lot of people to fuck off, so you wouldn't have been anyway sort of out on a limb there.
But I want to crow in a moment, at least for myself, if not for you, on how wonderful it is. I want to bathe in Remainer tears and celebrate the fact that we got this result. But unfortunately, just before you came to this interview, we got the news that the High Court has insisted that the Article 50 has to be put before put before Parliament. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it's a pretty extraordinary ruling, and a lot
So
of the 17 million.
unexpected?
Well, I think those people who had been following it closely thought that this was a possibility.
Yeah.
The courts are not fans of the royal prerogative, which was the defence that the government was making.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people will look at this and think that 17 million people voted one way because they wanted to put themselves outside the jurisdiction of a foreign court and some foreign judges.
Yeah.
Some people on the Remain side, wondered whether we would be able to maximise the benefits of Brexit because of the bureaucracy and the, sort of idiot judges at this end. And I think this may well be an example of how, as we go forward to try and, make the best of Brexit, you're going to see a lot of bureaucrats, judges, civil servants and people trying to get in the way of that.
Essentially, the entire establishment... I say the entire, I mean, there were one or two exceptions, but really the establishment was all behind Remain, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
And what we're seeing now is, the analogy I often use is the Second World War. We're inside Germany, it's 1945, but still you've got the kind of the werewolves, the sort of stay-behind SS, fighting their last-ditch defence, and they will do anything to frustrate the Allied victory.
Nicky Morgan is in her foxhole with her bayonet fixed, it's fair to say. I did a bit of broadcasting before I came to see you this morning, and as I was emerging from the BBC studio, Nicky Morgan was striding into it with that very long jolly hockey sticks lacrosse playing stride that she has, bouncing up and down with glee. So the likes of her and Peter Mandelson will be dining out on this one for some time to come.
I've noticed this on Twitter, that all the Remainers on Twitter are just essentially tossing themselves off with pleasure at the news, and it's a rather grim and depressing sight.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's going to get overturned. I mean, it will go to the Supreme Court. I'm told the Supreme Court have already set aside 2 days, possibly expecting this result to have their own conversation. Right. But I'm told they're even less in favour of the royal prerogative than the High Court is, and that there are certainly Remain ministers in the government legal service I've been exchanging messages with this morning who rather think this might stand. The interesting thing is, does this make Theresa May think again about holding a general election, which she's been absolutely adamant that she's not going to do? But if she thinks that somehow a Remain-stuffed House of Commons is going to overturn the democratic will of 17 million people in a referendum, she may well seek her own mandate.
Well, as you say, this was a massive popular vote to escape precisely the kind of slimy judicial activism that we're now seeing take place. I mean, left-wing lawyers, we thought we'd escape from the European Court of Justice and all their kind of insane decisions. We thought we were going to regain sovereignty, but essentially we've just farmed out the process to another set of equally annoying activist judges, equally determined to frustrate the popular will. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I think there's quite a lot in that, and it's not just the judges. You're going to see a lot of people frustrating the will of the people, and you know, one of the question marks over this is everyone says, well, we've got back control and we're going to throw out all these nasty, pointless EU bureaucratic regulations which are holding back our business and, you know, making life difficult for everybody. But you've somehow got to get those through the House of Commons to overturn them. The way Theresa May has chosen to go about this by repealing the 1972 European Communities Act effectively takes the whole of European law into British law, and we're going to have to overturn each of these things one by one. And the forces of, you know, what you would probably call the forces of reaction are going to be there fighting a counter-revolution for the next decade, trying to stop that sort of thing happening. It's going to be very difficult to loosen up, you know, workplace law in any meaningful way, it seems to me. And a lot of the regulations that have been imposed by Brussels will just be imposed by pointless British bureaucrats instead.
Yeah. So that wonderful surge of happiness that I felt, even now, the morning of June the 24th, when we got the result, when I woke up and heard the glorious news, is the happy place that I go to, in the same way that apparently Dave Cameron's happy place used to be when he went to Libya to briefly accept the adulation of the people for having liberated their country before it all went.
Somewhere just behind Nicolas Sarkozy. So it was, you know, he was a sort of silver medalist for adulation, but, you know, it was the best moment of his life.
But just as David Cameron's happy place has gone tits up in a kind of morass of ISIS terrorism and chaos, so it seems that my happy place may have been snatched away from them by the kind of people I really, really loathe. I mean, lawyers, left-wing lawyers, are about as low, way below cockroaches and those leeches that crawl up your penis in the jungle. I mean, they're definitely below that.
Well, that may be your view. I'd probably, yes, might take a slightly less activist view of it.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yes, I think all I would say about your happy place is that it's still a place you can fight for. David Cameron can't do anything much to fight for Libya anymore, but James Delingpole and people who agree with him, have got a good.
There are many,
and there are
17.5 million
indeed.
at least.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I might be so bold as to suggest, James, that that's probably the most people you've had on your side on an issue for quite some time. So,
Tim, I did actually feel that for once in my life I was a man of the people, and it felt good. It was like being on the right side in the English Civil War.
It's nice to be right now and again, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm right all the time. It's just that the people aren't always.
It's good to have the wisdom of the masses too.
Exactly. Now, what I want to do is go back in time and talk about some of the things that you discuss in your brilliant book, All Out War, which contains so much stuff I did not know about the backbiting and the infighting that went on, even within the two opposing camps. Now, if you had to single out the people who made Brexit possible, who would they be? Who are the names that we should put on brass plaques or even get statues in Parliament Square?
I think if you go right back, you have to say the people in the conservative Eurosceptic movement who put the issue of a referendum most on the agenda, and I think Daniel Hannan probably gets some credit.
Dan's number one for in a way
for the formative thoughts, and then you bring in Nigel Farage at that point for making that sort of concept something that had to be politically deliverable, and put Cameron in a position where he needed to offer a referendum, because if he didn't, he'd probably lose a general election.
So Nigel banging on about Europe.
Yep.
Made it impossible for the political class to ignore it.
Yeah, and doing well in the 2009 European elections and then winning the 2014 European elections. Cameron, of course, announced a referendum at the start of 2013, and he did so because they could already see that UKIP were likely to win the European elections in the following year, and they felt that they would be forced into it at that point, so they may as well get out ahead of the game. So those are the two guys who put it on the radar.
So Farage and Dan Hannan would be your two initial heroes.
Two initial heroes for Brexit, and then after that you're getting into the campaign. You can argue that Theresa May, in helping to kill off any prospect of David Cameron asking for an emergency brake on the number of EU migrants, plays a slightly subversive role in, and may, by some Brexiteers, be seen as a quite helpful guiding hand. Once you get to the campaign, there are heroes on both sides of the Brexit cause. I personally think that the campaign that Dominic Cummings ran out of Vote Leave was highly effective. He boiled a very difficult subject down into something that was easily digestible. Michael Gove gave it intellectual credibility and made it absolutely fine for decent middle-class people to go out and vote for Brexit. Boris Johnson gave it a huge amount of oomph. He gave it some respectability, but he made it fun, he made it easy to understand, and he reached a bunch of people that a lot of Tories find it very difficult to reach. Aaron Banks, who joined forces with Nigel Farage, caused Dominic Cummings a great deal of difficulty, but I think in the end it was well worthwhile having two different Leave campaigns competing with each other. Well, that's splendid news.
Can we just go back and in more detail on, I think, one of the most interesting characters that you mentioned, Dominic Cummings. Tell us a bit about Dominic. I've never met Dominic. I really want to.
I think you would like him a great deal, actually.
I think he shares my impatience with fools.
He shares your impatience with fools, with bureaucracy, with people who are not committed to doing things in the way that he thinks they ought to be done. Steve Baker, who's another of the minor heroes of this story, because he was very effective at marshalling the Brexit forces on the Tory backbenches.
RAF.
Former RAF engineer, not a man who's ever fired shots in anger, but boy did he fire them in anger during this referendum. This is a guy who helped, along with Bernard Jenkin and others, get the government to impose the usual purdah rules, which meant they couldn't muck about and spend taxpayers' money for the final month.
Which they tried to do, didn't they? I mean, reading your book, one realises that the establishment tried every trick in the book in order to frustrate the popular will, even before the referendum campaign had really taken off. So the purdah rules, where they wanted to have the Whitehall and ultimately taxpayers' money being spunked on the cause of propping up the Remain campaign, didn't they?
And Steve Baker was very good at spotting that was what was happening, and he marshalled the Tory forces in the House of Commons to stop that from happening. But he has this wonderful phrase about Dominic Cummings. He calls him political special forces. This is a guy who will go out and shoot the young of the enemy,
yes,
in extremis, if that's what it takes to win. He's not the kind of chap you want to have around during peacetime throwing hand grenades at defenceless civil servants, but he's a proper political operator. Andy Coulson did not want Dominic Cummings working anywhere in Whitehall when he was running Downing Street Communications. The second Andy Coulson sadly had to depart the scene, Michael Gove got Cummings in to basically change British education, and he went to war with civil servants, he went to war with the blob, the educational establishment, and he's just a highly effective guy who knows how to go about winning things and imposing your will on the public. And one of the great sadnesses of all of this, to me, is that had Boris Johnson become Prime Minister with Michael Gove at his side, Dominic Cummings would have been back in Whitehall, chucking his hand grenades, getting Jeremy Hayward fired, and basically bringing in a bunch of political appointees and saying we've got to do things very differently in this country, and if we're going to maximise the benefits of Brexit, we have to basically tear the whole thing up. And that's what he did during the campaign, and that's why he was effective. I do a lot of public speaking. When I ask people what was the slogan for Vote Leave, everybody in that room will be able to tell you that it was take back control, and they'll be able to tell you that we were sending £350 million a week to Brussels. If you ask people what the slogan was for the other side and what their campaign was all about, you get a sea of blank faces, and that tells you most of what you need to know about how their campaign...
It was BSE, wasn't it? Bovine spongiform encephalitis.
Well, and this is another insight into Cummings. As soon as he saw that the opposition were calling themselves Britain Stronger in Europe, he was absolutely cock-a-hoop. He immediately declared that this was the BSE campaign, and that every opportunity his spokespeople got on the television, they should call it the BSE campaign until such time as the other lot got riled and lost their temper. And this worked time and time and time again.
So, do you subscribe to the great men of history school? In other words, do you think that if you remove these personalities from the equation, we would still have won a Brexit vote? Or do you think it was thanks to the genius, the demented genius of people like Dominic Cummings and the charisma and comedy value of Boris Johnson and the politeness and intelligence of Michael Gove? Without these people, we might still have voted Remain.
I personally believe so. I mean, people need to read the book and judge for themselves. I mean, we've got a pretty weighty tome here that covers the campaign. You can argue that the things that really mattered, ultimately, the biggest influences on voting for Brexit, worth 3 decades of Euroscepticism and a view that a lot of people have lost out as a result of globalisation. But what turned that from a sort of sense and a feeling into going out and putting votes on ballot papers, I think, is down to a very small number of people. And you can make the argument that pretty well everything Michael Gove did between mid-February this year and the start of July changed the course of British history every time he made his mind up. Without him, would Boris Johnson have backed Leave? It's distinctly possible that it would have been a lot more difficult for Boris. Gove gave credibility to it, and he gave cover to Boris to do it. The two of them together, all the polls that David Cameron had told him from the beginning that if he didn't have those guys on side, it was going to be a lot more difficult, and thus it proved. And in terms of individuals running the campaign, you'd have to say that the decisions that Dominic Cummings made and that Nigel Farage made along the way, did change things each time they did them. 600,000 people change their minds and we have a different result. And as you go through the story of this whole campaign and the decisions Cameron made and the decisions Cummings made in particular, if they'd made different decisions, I think it's quite easy to see how some of those votes would shift. And there are probably a dozen different things that happened that might have shifted some votes, and together it seems to me entirely possible that they would have shifted more than 600,000.
We're going to have a break now, and in the next section I'm going to demonstrate why I too should be in your book as one of the people who made Brexit possible.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
So Tim, I want you to read this text exchange between Gove and me. When rumours appeared in the Mail on Sunday at the beginning of 2016, January 2016, that he was going to come out for Remain, So I texted him rather anxiously.
Is that MOS story true? Asks frankly quite frightened Delingpole. You can see even in quite a banal text message that the fear in your typing fingers.
You can.
I am undecided, says Gove. Promise, says Delingpole, now particularly desperate. I still haven't made up my mind. I'm torn between what I feel about the EU and the loyalty I owe the PM. So at least Gove was consistent in public in the way that he had been in private. Now, Delingpole summoning his finest oratory in the form of a banal text message. Not many people get the chance in their lives to save Britain. Drake, Nelson, Churchill, your call. No pressure then, says Gove.
So you see, I think when the paperback edition comes out, you can actually credit me as the sixth man who brought about the
John Cairncross of this operation.
I am the John Cairncross of this operation. Now, we should talk about Gove because we both know him quite well, and he is the most fascinating character. I mean, I think we can agree he was one of the most effective ministers in the Cameron various governments.
Well, I think when David Cameron searches for a legacy that isn't taking us out of the European Union by mistake, he will draw on two things. One is the welfare reforms that Ian Duncan Smith got underway, and the other is the education stuff that Michael Gove did. And it's quite instructive, isn't it, that he managed to lose both of those ministers from those positions as he went about his business.
Yeah, it is. And interesting, too, that the person who made Gove's education reforms happen was the man we've mentioned earlier, Dominic Cummings, and the man who also made Brexit happen. You almost needed this kind of almost satanic figure.
Well, Cummings is sort of the provisional wing of Gove, if you will.
Yes.
He's the sort of Gove's the chap who sits around in if we're going to stretch this analogy till it breaks, the IRA Army Council formulating dreams of a united Ireland, and Cummings is the chap who goes out and plants the explosive. That's basically...
Yes, that's it. Gove's wearing his sweater, his chunky knit sweater.
Not that we should compare Brexit to the atrocities of the IRA, of course.
No. But nevertheless, I see exactly the point you're making, that Michael Gove is such an extraordinarily charming character, isn't he? I mean, I think even if you hated Gove and you spent 10 minutes in his company, you could not fail to like him.
And that, I think, is what happened with a lot of teachers. They would go into these sessions with him and sort of loathing him on principle, and would come away feeling slightly soiled because they rather enjoyed his company. And he's a very effective political thinker and a political operator. The other, just as an aside, one of the interesting things doing this book, I interviewed about 100 people and had hours and hours of tapes and transcripts and all the rest of it. And when the transcripts would come in, you would sort of read them and you would see who actually spoke in any kind of coherent way. A lot of people begin a sentence, break off, their thoughts are ill-formed. There were two people who spoke almost entirely in complete sentences with subclauses in the right place, and their sentences formed whole paragraphs where thought was coherent. One of those was Michael Gove. The other, incidentally, was Dan Hannan, who was also... his thoughts come out of his mouth in a very considered fashion.
They're both masters of oratory, and both... Gove wasn't union president, No, he wasn't union president. No, I don't think
so.
But
he was a votary of the Boris cult, as he describes it himself. He helped Boris get elected as union president, which is why, when years later it all went pear-shaped. There's a lot of going on here that goes back many years.
A tip to younger listeners, actually, that if you really want to get on in life, certainly in politics, you've got to be a debater at the Oxford Union.
We Cambridge men can only look at that and say, whatever happened to our generation? The last Cambridge generation that was any good was a considerable time ago now. The King Clark kind of gang were reasonably effective at taking over the Tory party, but historically they've been a lot less effective than the PPE Oxford Union crowd.
I was at your union, the Cambridge Union, the other day, and even now there's such an obvious distinction between the two universities in that when you go to the Oxford Union, they're really quite aggressive. The audience are certainly quite aggressive. Then they're really quite hostile. Cambridge people are probably more left-wing, actually, but they're much more polite. They treat you better when you're a visiting right-wing speaker, I've noticed. But maybe that that and also that Oxford people, I think, probably have a little more flamboyance, let's say. And I think maybe that combination of aggression and flamboyance is what they so dominate politics.
No, it's interesting. I mean, in my time at Cambridge, I can't, with the exception of Lucy Fraser, who was president of the union and is now a Conservative MP in Cambridgeshire, none of the generation while I was there has been very successful. Kwasi Kwarteng was there at the same time, and
he's more like an Oxford man.
He is very much more like an Oxford
Yeah.
man. This is a guy who wants to put VAT on children's clothes and do it with a flourish.
Yes.
And he hasn't prospered particularly, but maybe if he'd been at Oxford, he would have done.
He's a very sound. I love Kwasi. Yes. Maybe I'll interview. Maybe he can tell me about how he wants to make children cry by making their clothes more expensive. He sounds my kind of fellow. Let's go back to Gove, because I think you have some very interesting theories on why it was that Gove finally took the decision, the momentous decision, probably the referendum changing decision, to join the Leave camp rather than stay loyal to the Prime Minister?
Well, the short, simple answer is that he believed in it, and
Yeah.
most of the people around him wanted him to do it, and wanted him to be true to himself. With Michael, the question is not why did he do it, but why did he not do it? And the loyalty thing was a big thing for him. David Cameron, had put him at the centre of this glittering group of Oxford people who took over the Tory party. But Michael, I think, felt that the bonds of loyalty that bound him to David Cameron had been somewhat weakened when Cameron removed him as Education Secretary. And there's some interesting... I've spoken to a lot of people around Michael Gove, and this is a theory that several of them have advanced, that Gove was never quite one of the Notting Hill gang. And at Oxford he was at a fairly unfashionable college, LMH. And all the people he sort of looked up to were at Brasenose and Christchurch and the sort of glittering spires of, one of his friends said to me, it's all a bit like Brideshead Revisited, where, which had been on the telly a couple of years before the Gove generation went to Oxford.
It was very much people wandering around with teddy bears,
Yeah.
Modelling themselves on Sebastian and Charles. I did. I think a lot of people did, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what Michael found was this was a very glittering world. He was admitted to the sort of the dinner parties and became, the intellectual force, the entertainer, the guy who was there to sort of keep everybody else happy and give the project that they were trying to pursue, which ultimately was to obtain power, some kind of intellectual heft and a bit of glamour. But a lot of his real friends who are not part of that group think that to some degree he was always one of them said he wasn't even the day boy really. They treated him a little bit like a performing monkey. They thought he was slightly odd, this chap who'd come from Aberdeen with won scholarships, got himself to Oxford. He had all these ideas, he had these convictions, and a lot of the people around Cameron thought that was all a little bit peculiar, and ultimately they felt that loyalty would be the thing that would trump these slightly odd passions that Michael had. They knew he was an absolute stone-cold, resolute, 24-carat Eurosceptic, but they still thought that the ties that bind would keep him there. And I don't think David Cameron had understood that by moving him from education and making him chief whip...
Which he didn't want at all.
Well, despite what Craig Oliver says in his book, Michael Gove did not wish to be chief whip and had never expressed any desire to be, so far as I'm aware, or anybody that I've ever spoken to is aware. When that happened, he felt that it was, and the people around him felt that it was a betrayal and convinced him that it was. The ties of loyalty work in both directions. One of Gove's close friends, who knows Cameron well, said to me that, Dave just sort of thought it would all be fine, and because he's a jammy so-and-so, for a long time it was. Michael's not someone who likes confrontation. He goes up, he kept his head down, he went off, he took his 30 grand pay cut, he went and did the job he'd been asked to do and made the best of it. But he wasn't happy, and he became happy again when he was given the Justice Department, which allowed him again to think big reforming thoughts and get stuck into the sort of, the social reform of Britain, which is what gets him out of bed in the morning. But when it came to that decision, I don't think that Michael, and particularly not his wife Sarah Vine, who tweeted what an appalling thing it was when he was fired, there was nobody around him who was saying, you absolutely have to do this because David Cameron has been resolute with you. David Cameron had not been. And I think if anything persuaded him that he didn't need to remain loyal, it was probably that.
Gove does see things through a filter of Game of Thrones, and he once described himself to me as...
what is one of the most extraordinary YouTube videos that you can ever watch. And I would urge all people listening to this to Google it at once and watch it as you were listening to this part of the conversation, because nothing describes the psychological process that Michael Gove went through quite so much as what he said in your garden about Tyrion Lannister.
And it was only an accidental thing. Just Gove happened to be in my neck of the woods, and I thought, I've got this video camera, I'll make a video. And I just sort of ambushed him and got him to talk about some random topic that I thought might tickle his fancy. And Game of Thrones just happened to push the right buttons.
But and it goes back to what we were talking about. He talks about Tyrion Lannister being this, outsider, this someone who is disparaged even by the members of his closest clan. And I think that does reflect some of what we've just been talking about. And ultimately, this is a guy who shot his father dead with a crossbow bolt through the guts. And it's quite hard to see what happened with David Cameron and not see some parallels there.
And also, of course, the other parallel is what happened later on, after the referendum, when he took out Boris, when he was effectively Kingslayer, wasn't he?
Yeah, he could have been the hand of the king, and he ended up as the Kingslayer instead.
Yes. And he will always be cursed with that name now, even though he's far better than that. He's not just Kingslayer, he's a jolly nice chap, even though he's got one arm and...
Well, the Kingslayer was not unsuccessful even after he'd slayed the king, so there is some hope of a revival for Govians, I think.
Well, I hope so. He's surely by far the most talented minister of the Cameron era. He ought not to be in outer darkness forever.
No, and actually some of the people around Theresa May, May herself felt that Gove needed to be taught a bit of a lesson, I think. They know that he's a talent, and at the moment he's being pathologically loyal in a way that George Osborne and Nicky Morgan and others are not being. I saw some people around May quite recently, and they intimated to me that it's not impossible that he could come back. And I think they know there'll be a moment where the balance of advantage for may well be in bringing him back in. But the question for Michael ahead of that is to what degree he finds some new passions and some new projects and some new sort of reforming thoughts, and whether they are compatible with what Theresa May is trying to do. If he would put to work on some of the stuff that she wants to achieve socially in helping the what she calls the just coping classes, Gove could has shown himself to be one of the most interesting thinkers on the right in British politics. And if he devotes himself to playing a constructive role in helping her to deliver that agenda, he may well yet have a third life in British politics.
He might, but we know in somewhere in a parallel universe there is a world where Gove and Boris maybe Boris is Prime Minister and Gove is his hand, and Gove is out there doing really, really sensible things, like really rolling back the frontiers of big government and slashing spending and getting Britain on track economically and making sure that prisons are reformed, carrying on his education reforms, doing all the things that a true classical liberal ideologue like myself would think was just the most wonderful thing. Britain would become a kind of the new Singapore. Everyone would get richer because our economy would thrive. Why do you think that Gove ducked that opportunity and decided to slay the Mad King? Is it because the king was mad?
It's partly that he had come during what was a very frenzied time to think that the king was not performing as well as he thought that someone in that position ought to perform. Yeah. It was also that there were a couple of people who never really wanted Michael Gove to support Boris Johnson.
Who were they?
Primarily Nick Bowles, I think, who was very close to him, with the other sort of intellectual Tory who saw... Bowles was a guy who, respected Cameron, came to see him as the best way of delivering the kind of socially liberal world that he wanted to see, but he never really thought that David Cameron was the real deal. He thought Michael Gove was the real deal, and he was absolutely desperate for Gove to run. I had a conversation with Nick Bowles about a week before the referendum where he made it very clear he was going to beg Gove to do it under all circumstances. He didn't think Boris was the right guy for the job. And yet, a short while later, Gove basically said, I'm going to back Boris. And Bowles had spent the referendum campaign having blazing rows with Gove. They were on the opposite sides of the issue, and he didn't want to be separated from his friends, so he agreed to go along with it. But Nick had spent time working with Boris in City Hall. He was his first chief of staff. He'd seen what was then a very chaotic period. And when Gove began to waver later in the week, people like Nick Bowles and Henry Newman, who was one of Gove's special advisors, to some degree his wife Sarah, old friends like Baroness Simone Finn, Henry Cook, who was also working for him, there became quite a fevered atmosphere that basically said Boris is not doing this right. And once they decided that they couldn't actually vote for him, they thought, well, the logical thing is, if you don't want Theresa May to be the Prime Minister, you better do it yourself. The interesting thing is that those people who were not in that bubble that week, who are friends of Gove, gave him the opposite advice. Dominic Cummings was around until sort of the Tuesday evening and then disappeared up to Durham, where his family live, and was out of it during that sort of key 36-hour period. The first he knew that Michael had decided to change his mind and go for it himself was at about 1:30 in the morning. Paul Stevenson, who had been at Cummings' side running Vote Leave, they pulled him in to run Gove's campaign, but he was asked his opinion. Henry de Zoot, who had been Michael Gove's other special advisor when Cummings was working with him, they were all asked what they thought, and they all said it was a bad idea and that you would be Ed Miliband times 100. People would see you as the great betrayer. It would hand the leadership on a plate to Theresa May, and no attempt really was made to sort of get Boris to buck his ideas up. And the grievance of the Johnsonians is that there was an opportunity late on that Wednesday evening to try and turn things around. Say, look, this speech isn't good enough, or you need to get on with this. Pull your finger out. Andrea Leadsom was about to declare the following morning that she was going it alone, but no attempt was made to get her back on board. There'd been this ludicrous farce of Boris sending her a letter or sending her a tweet saying that she was going to get one of the top jobs in his government, and it's quite extraordinary, really, that none of the people around Boris seemed to know that this was all collapsing. Partly, I think, because some of the people around Gove did not fully inform them of what was going on. And the whole thing was a mess. There's a sort of, there's a probably 70-page section in the book on this week. What is the most extraordinary week in British politics? And there's probably 30 pages on that final day. And blowing one's own trumpet, I think that's the best bit of the book, frankly, because it is sourced from pretty well everybody who was in the room on both sides. And what comes to you is not that there were a bunch of evil people who stitched this up in advance, but that this was an extraordinarily chaotic period where a bunch of quite clever people could have sat around and resolved the situation. You had Linton Crosby, you had Michael Gove, you had Dominic Cummings, you had all these guys who could have been involved in delivering a victory in a leadership election, and the whole thing descended into a ludicrous farce. There's several occasions where I was tempted, I think I only write it once in the book, for the want of a nail, a kingdom was lost, and it just sort of unravelled in the most extraordinary circumstances. I don't think Gove plotted it all months in advance, as some people...
he wouldn't be capable of it. He's not. That's not what he's
like. It would be ludicrous. But ultimately, Michael now acknowledges that he made... he got it wrong. He should either have run himself or not committed quite so quickly to Boris, or got more of the commitments from Boris that some of the people around him wanted him to get, or that he should have sat around and resolved the problems that they had rather than doing what he did. And Gove's decisions during the campaign were what delivered victory, but Gove's decisions during that week were what delivered defeat ultimately to him and the people around him.
So we know the way the Brexit vote went, but now we're in this weird limbo period where we've got Theresa May saying Brexit means Brexit, and yet at the same time we've got people who understand, who are cynical about the political system, let's say, people like Peter Hitchens, people probably like Christopher Booker, who else has been saying this? Quite a few people have been saying, even if we ever win a referendum vote, we're never going to get out of Europe because the establishment will so arrange it that we don't. Now, I think in your book you mentioned, for example, two particularly worm-tongue-like civil servants who were
both happily still with us.
Yes, who are they?
So Ivan Rogers is he's the UK permanent representative in Brussels, effectively our ambassador to the European Union, which is a role he's held for several years. And the other chap is a guy called Tom Scholar, who throughout the duration of most of the stuff going on in this book was David Cameron's Europe advisor in Downing Street in the Cabinet Office. He is now the permanent secretary at the Treasury, which, as we know, is sort of leading the resistance, as it were, pointing out all the economic perils and urging us to remain in the single market and not go for what a lot of Eurosceptics would like to see, a harder form of Brexit. Those guys are both still there. A lot of the people around David Cameron who I spoke to for the book are furious that those people effectively made it very difficult for them to get the kind of deal that might have allowed them to win the referendum. So you could say, from your perspective, that they joined the list of the heroes of Brexit, in that they said you can't do this, Dave, because it's outside of European law. A lot of those people around Cameron now say, and they were, admittedly some of the more middle-ranking junior aides who felt that Cameron should ask for more. You ask for 10 things and you get 7. Instead, Osborne made, and the civil servants we've been talking about, made Cameron think that he had to ask for 4 things and get a sort of watered-down version of all 4, and that would be enough. They don't think it was enough. And what was required was not to say this was within the parameters, the tramlines of European law. It was to say, well, we're trying to change European law. The whole point of this was to have a fundamental renegotiation. And those were the guys stopping it. And there are people in Whitehall now, certainly around Liam Fox and to some degree around David Davis, who think that those people are now saying, well, you can't ask for this, you can't do that. And the type of Brexit that we have will partly be shaped by people who were involved in screwing it up the last time.
Yeah, exactly. And now this is... people are often drawing parallels between the Trump phenomenon and Brexit, and we can probably agree that they're sometimes overdone. But I think in a general sense, this popular feeling that there is this entrenched political elite which is determined to frustrate the popular will with its bureaucracy. It seems to me that those two people you mentioned, Scholar and Rogers, are they Wickhamists, by the way?
Pass on that.
They're sort of people who might have gone to Winchester, I think.
I think from your end of things, that's probably a fair comment.
So yeah. There is this class of worm-tongues who are just determined to negate everything that we want, we the people. I mean, this is why people, I think, feel that we haven't really got a democracy, or that democracy is broken, and why they get so angry, and why they get so rebellious.
Yeah, I think, as you say, I think these are people who have a certain worldview, and also, they look at the rules and they think that they're, from their point of view, if there are ways of doing things that, will stop us being sued, that's their duty to tell the Prime Minister of the day.
Well, they're the other
I mean, the civil service will take legal advice and will say that it's their duty and responsibility to point out where there are issues. So if Ivan Rogers says to Theresa May, look, you might lose this court case in the High Court, is that them being worm-tongues, or is that pointing out, legitimately that, there may potentially be a problem here? But I think, what a lot of Brexiteers would say is that there's not a willingness to sort of get outside the tramlines of convention, and that's where the problem's going to arise. Yeah,
well, of course. I mean, I'm sure that a cunning lawyer can use the law in any way he wishes to get the result, and we've seen that this morning in this High Court ruling. And if it goes to the Supreme Court and they too, well, it suddenly gets rather exciting, doesn't it? I mean, we get a general election, surely.
Potentially, yeah.
Well,
I mean, Theresa May is adamant she doesn't want one, but I would have thought this would be one of the things that would tip her over the edge, potentially.
And obviously, with the Labour Party in disarray under Corbyn, they haven't got a prayer of winning an election. Is it possible that Theresa May could be toppled if a new government was formed? How would that work?
Well, it depends what platform she puts herself on in a general election. If she does it in such a way that the argument she's making is not the one that some of the Brexiteers would like them to make.
Talking about Theresa May, and
yes.
And we're talking about,
general election,
will
yes.
she remain Prime Minister?
I think she's got a very good chance of remaining Prime Minister if she can keep the forces of Brexit on side. She's got a problem with some of the people in her own party who backed Remain, but ultimately she's got this great mandate that she can sort of set herself up as tribune of the people, both internationally and domestically.
Yeah.
So she goes off abroad and says, look, I've got these 17.5 million people behind me. I can do nothing more than to represent their wishes, and in terms of domestic policy, she has quite deliberately positioned herself in a way where she wants to fight for the kind of people who voted for Brexit. And if she can keep kind of doing that, she's got every chance of being Prime Minister for at least 9 years, it seems to me.
Right. Yeah. I'm personally saddened by that. Not because I mean, I'm not viciously anti her yet, but I do feel that she's closer to being continuation Cameron than she would ever like to admit. For example, the Hinkley C power station, which should never have been given the go-ahead. HS2, which really should have been nixed. It's a massive waste of money. She seems to be addicted to this kind of, big government, really.
I think the view she took on Hinkley was that she didn't much like it, and she wanted to show that she was prepared to pull in a decision like that and look at it properly. But in a sense, I think Brexit conditioned the response, and I think she felt that if she'd pulled the plug on it, you would have had a situation that would have sent a very bad message about sticking to signed contracts and deals done with foreign countries at a time when we need to attract people to invest here and do deals. So had she been Prime Minister in different circumstances, I have every expectation that she would have killed that deal off. But I think she felt that doing so in the current climate would have sent the kind of message that would have been unhelpful.
This is perhaps the saddest legacy of Brexit, and we're going to end on this one. But is it not that people feel like they've been a bit naughty, like they've pushed things a bit far, and some people have been scared? Well, mainly the Remain-tards have been scared by this, and as we see on Twitter every day, and there was this sense abroad among the political class that we ought to rein in all that excitement and energy. We don't want to get too much like Singapore, because that would be scary. I mean,
it's a little bit like the death of Princess Diana, it seems to me, where there was a kind of mass hysteria and people felt it was a little bit un-British somehow. And I think there's a feeling that amongst some of the Remain classes that this is, we're now sort of doing a little bit too much to sanctify the views of the people who voted for Brexit.
But like just having Brexit, you mean? Yeah.
Well,
that would really be over the top, wouldn't it?
No, I don't. No, I don't agree with that. I think I think we're all Brexiteers now, and we're arguing over the nature of it.
That is how they feel.
Yes, I think you put your finger on something interesting there.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I put my finger on something interesting, because that's a good way to round off this podcast. Thank you very much, Tim Shipman.
AP Update. I'm Diane Kepley. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu heads to the White House today for his first meeting with President Trump and what may be an easing of the strains he felt with the Obama administration. Our Mark Smith explains.
Under President Obama, who found Netanyahu difficult, to put it mildly, those ties were strained by the Iran nuclear deal and also by U.S. opposition to constantly expanding Israeli settlements. Trump has vowed to change all that. Yet since taking office, he's also surprised the Israelis with a warning those settlements are not helpful in negotiating peace with the Palestinians.
Speaking of the Palestinians, there's no comment yet from the White House, but Palestinian officials are saying that President Mahmoud Abbas met secretly with the CIA director Mike Pompeo yesterday in Ramallah. They say Pompeo was briefed on Palestinian positions in advance of today's talks in Washington. White House officials have suggested the Trump administration may try to find a path to peace in the Middle East that does not involve a two-state solution. AP Update. I'm Diane Kepley.